beautiful people. Now that you've got your log line, your subject, and all the rest of it, and lately your characters, you're probably wondering, what do I do with them? They have to do something. It's a motion picture. They have to have some kind of motion. Well, now you can start actually plotting your story. Now, I know you're probably quite eager to start actually sitting down and writing fade-in, interior, but I personally like to write an outline first. And before I write my outline, I actually like to ask myself, once again, what is the perspective of my film? Because, like I said with the example about E.T., Elliot's perspective really dictates the structure of the story, because it tells us where we start just before Elliot and E.T.'s lives become intertwined, and then it ends the second that they're untwined, sorry. That dictates the structure. Now, this becomes a bit more complicated when you choose to do a non-linear story, which is why you have to have a very good reason for putting things out of sequence. But in something such as Bergman and Bergman's Autumn Sonata, even though the actual film takes place over the course of, let's say a weekend, it's very interesting to note that a lot of the flashbacks have even though the film is about a mother-daughter relationship, a lot of the flashbacks actually have an absence of the mother in them. And that tells you something very important about the neglectful nature of that relationship, and also shows you that it's really being told from the daughter's perspective. Now, you've got the start and you've got the end. What about the middle? The middle is very important because I think that you have to have a substantial change in the middle. Even if everything goes back status quo antebellum, which is how things were before the war. Even if things go back to how they were at the start, your middle still needs to be very different from both the start and the end. I'll explain my thinking behind this. You're going to just sort of establish the world or show how things, or sort of keep things in stasis for a while, then those scenes aren't adding anything. We might as well just get rid of them, and more so at the end, because we know nothing's going to change after this. This is actually why I hate the idea of the first act. The first act should be over like that. It shouldn't be 15 pages. Let's say you are doing a 30-minute sitcom though, okay? So you know that everything's going to return back to normal, just like the end. And that's perfectly all right. The Passion of Anna is an example of a film where Andreas is a lonely drunk at the beginning of the film, and after his best friend commits suicide and he narrowly escapes being murdered, he's still a lonely drunk. That's perfectly valid. The Clockwork Orange is another example of a film where everything sort of returns back to normal. There's nothing wrong with that. But you still need to focus on that middle point. And let's say we're writing a 30-minute sitcom episode. Now, the reason why they always return back to normal is because when episodes are being shown in syndication, people aren't paying attention or may even have the opportunity to actually observe the character arc over a season. So you want it so they can watch things almost Brechtian style, out of sequence. Let's say you're writing an episode, The Simpsons, and you decide to, and so your logline is Bart runs away from home on Thanksgiving. Now you can think about, okay, where are we going to start? Somewhere around Thanksgiving. We know we're going to end. We know he's going to have to come back at some point. So we know that once he's come back, that's when we're going to end. And we know the middle is probably going to be after Thanksgiving has started, and we know he's going to probably be the furthest point away from home that he'll ever be, because he has to come back at some point. It's not exactly true, but we do know that he'll already be out of the house, because otherwise we'd still be at the start. So now that you have your middle, you can actually start plotting. David Mamet actually said something very interesting about this. He said that if you're writing it like a silent movie, you're writing good drama. 1/3 of the human brain is dedicated to visual processing. 93% human communication is non-verbal. Let's just say it's true, because everyone keeps repeating this fact. Maybe we don't need to actually worry about dialogue. After all, Menander and even John Cleese and Connie Booth left the dialogue for last, and Curb Your Enthusiasm is not even written with dialogue. I think you're starting to get the picture, not the motion picture, though. What I like to do is I like to write with verbs. How do you actually do that? Well, maybe I should give you an example. Let's say John talks to Mary. Let's say this is a fragment from a film that obviously includes a person called John and Mary. Now, the problem is, just how does John talk to Mary? It's not visual. I want to see both John and Mary's body language in my mind's eye. I need to be able to visualize the gestures, the manners, the behaviors, the body language, the posture. Now, is he negotiating with her? Is he pontificating to her? Or is he begging to her? Or is he seducing her? These are all different manners of talking. And in fact, he could actually be talking about the same thing, but they're all different ways. Now, knowing which way is the appropriate way, this is where it's very important to remember who your character is and their beliefs, their value systems, their relationship with one another. Because remember, two characters with very diametrically opposed value systems, there could be a lot of conflict there. Or people could be trying to avoid conflict, or they could be very defensive. Or maybe the character is so smitten by the pretty blonde that he'll acquiesce to any of her demands, even if they're against his fundamental values, because he's so attracted to her. Let's embellish our outline fragment a little bit. How about John talks to Mary about dinner? Mary gets a call. Mary goes to her mother's. Her mother is very upset. Now, what's wrong with this? Well, actually quite a lot. Firstly, we still don't know the manner that John is going to be talking to Mary. We don't know what provoked Mary to go to her mother's. We can assume it was the phone call. And we don't know in what manner her mother is upset. We can't see it. I'm going to go on a little aside for a moment. At the heart of all storytelling and narrative, I think, is causation. I believe that humans develop narrative not as a means of communication and explaining things to one another, but as a means of understanding ourselves why other members of the tribe are acting a certain way. One of the huntsmen goes out that morning, he's got a big grin on his face, he's really happy, jaunty step, and he comes back and he's in a bad mood. You know that something happened while he was on the hunt that made him really down. You don't need to actually have seen it, but you can infer it. And that inference is the essence of narrative. It is essential to storytelling. It is essential to filmmaking. Actually, the creators of South Park, Matt Stone and Trey Parker, have this little linguistic trick which I think is wonderful. When they're outlining, they don't say, this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. They will say, this happens, but this happened. Therefore, this happens. Once you start writing things like this, it actually creates a causal chain that makes those inferences very clear and decisive. So to go back to our example, I'm going to punch it up a little more. Let's say John talks to Mary, but Mary gets a call from her mother. Therefore, Mary goes to her mother's, but her mother is very upset. See, all the events have tied together. We can do a little better. Remember what I said about having visual verbs? How you should actually be able to see the manner that John is acting with Mary, the way Mary is reacting to him. Start picking very visual verbs. How about John remonstrates Mary about dinner, but Mary gets a phone call from her mother, therefore Mary escapes from John, but Mary has to help her mother look for her missing dog. But Mary's mother is unhelpful because she's so busy wailing and crying. Now we're actually getting somewhere. Now we can actually see the events, and there's a clear causal chain because we use but and therefore. In fact, we can go a bit further. You want to start embellishing this because chances are you're working from the middle of your logline and you want to branch out to the start and the end. The most important tool you can have as a screenwriter is to ask, what was the character doing before this scene got in the way? So what was John doing before he remonstrated Mary about dinner? The lazy thing would be to say, oh, well, she overcooked the roast. That sucks. What we want to hear is something like John is having an affair and he just learned from his mistress that she's moving to another country. So he's angry about that, but he's holding it back. And that's the reason why he's remonstrating Mary about dinner. Now, why has the dog gone missing? Maybe Mary's mother has dementia and forgot that she locked it. Or maybe Mary's mother is actually very lonely. And she's using this as a means of emotionally blackmailing Mary into keeping her company. And the dog is actually locked in a cupboard, which also, now that I think about it, what happens when Mary actually finds the dog in the cupboard and her mother has to explain that situation to her? Now we have another scene. When you ask what was this character doing before this scene got in the way, you start getting this, wonderful way of just embellishing what happens before and afterwards. You still have to be careful, though. You have to be careful about the way you structure it. All stories basically observe the same structure. This basic structure, attempt, failure, attempt, failure, attempt, failure, either big success or big failure. Almost all films and stories observe this basic structure. But there are nuances to it. And one of the ones that I discovered was actually when I was in the editing room of my feature film. I had this sequence where my main character, he was looking for clues about the whereabouts of someone. And so I had this very non-verbal sequence, it was like a silent movie, where he was looking, and then but he wouldn't find anything, he kept looking, wouldn't find anything, kept looking, wouldn't find anything. And then he found one clue, and then he found another clue, and then he found another clue. And I thought, because this had a nice sort of progressing, rising tension arc, this should do fine. But it just wasn't working. And then, I don't know why, I had the idea, well, what if I bring one of the clues earlier? So I had him looking, fail, finds one clue. Then he keeps looking, failing, keeps looking, finds nothing, keeps looking, finds another clue, keeps looking, failing, and then he finds the big clue. And all of a sudden it started working. And later on I realized that stage magicians do the same thing, where they'll pretend to fail the trick or have a mishap or something, or act surprised and like they're trying to hide something going wrong. Because it actually increases the doubt and the uncertainty, and therefore it's more satisfying when they actually complete the trick, which they were going to do anyway. What you want is little victories and little defeats. At the heart of this principle is asymmetry. When you have a role reversal, there's an asymmetry of power. The principle of asymmetry really is just at the heart of drama and comedy, and apparently stage magic. Asymmetry is about swinging the pendulum in the other direction. I think things like The Prince and the Pauper, or any kind of role reversal, even von Stroheim's The Merry Widow, is full of asymmetries and role reversals where who had the power or who was the more desirable one is switched in. Farces do this all the time. I know I keep going on about farces, but farces are really good examples of all these principles. Because you have one character who has more knowledge or information than the other, or they have information or knowledge that the other doesn't have. There's an asymmetry going on there. And things get interesting when the roles reverse, or someone finds out something that someone didn't know, but they didn't know. An example of asymmetry at work is in Hitchcock's North by Northwest, or a lot of Spielberg's films. I mean, Duel, War of the Worlds, any of his films, I suppose even Terminal, anything where there's a single man or a character who's being pursued by an unimaginably more powerful foe or enemy. Those are all examples of asymmetry, and that tension in the vulnerability against like this unstoppable force, that's interesting. That's an asymmetry. You can put asymmetries into individual scenes, and you can put it into the overall plot. It also affects the structure. It gives you that nice crescendo and climax, which is why in the end of the first Star Wars, the Death Star has to blow up. James Bond, it's not enough for him to sort of foil the evil genius's plan. The secret headquarters has to blow up. In a sports movie, they have to win the world championship. They also have to have that home run that they knock it right out of the park. They hit it for 6. You have to end on something bigger than you start. You have to have a victory or a defeat. Yes, it can be a defeat that is bigger and more powerful than all the little victories and defeats that I was talking about earlier that you've had all throughout the story. Or you end in a role reversal like in Bergman's Persona. So, what have we learned in this episode? Well, we have learned that my personal predilection is to write an outline first. I've told you that before you start doing that, think about the perspective, and the perspective should govern the structure of your story, where you start and where you end. Now, you can start thinking about the middle, which is something that you should find in your logline. There should be a dramatic change there, and change is very important because this is a visual motion picture. Everything you write in your outline should be visual. Use the button therefore technique, which the South Park creators use, in order to create a causal link, a causal chain in between the events. Ask yourself, what was the character doing before this scene to embellish upon that? And then finally, use the principle of asymmetry to give yourself a nice crescendo and little victories and little defeats to keep the audience wondering. That's how you imbue your outline with a good structure. Until next time, I'm Constantine. Please stay sublime.